All Rise is a podcast where you're the jury. We'll put Christianity and other worldviews in the courtroom as we address the claims for and objections against the Christian faith, all from a legal perspective. Our host is Abdu Murray, lawyer, author, former Muslim-turned-Christian, and speaker with Embrace the Truth. Abdu was named several times in Best Lawyers in America and Michigan Super Lawyer, and he will bring objections right from the very lips of atheists, agnostics, and various religions to see whether Christianity holds up to courtroom-level scrutiny.
Simply read Mark's account of Jesus' death and then read John's account of Jesus' death and make a list of everything that happens in both and compare your lists. You will find that there are stunning differences. In fact, there are discrepancies. Let me give you just a list of very quick examples. What day did Jesus die on? That's a simple question. And luckily, we're told in both Mark and John. In Mark's gospel, we're told that Jesus died the day after the Passover meal was eaten in Jerusalem. John tells us explicitly, chapter 19, verse 14, that Jesus died the day before the Passover meal was eaten, on the day of preparation for the Passover. That's different. He couldn't die both days. What about the time? According to Mark, he died at 9 in the morning. According to John, he wasn't condemned to death until afternoon. John 19:14. These are accounts that differ from one another. Did both robbers mock Jesus, or did only one of them mock him and the other come to his defense? It depends which gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died, or was it after he died? It depends which gospel you read. Who went to the tomb on the third day? Did Mary Magdalene go alone, or did Mary go with other women? Depends which gospel you read. If with other women, how many of them were there? What were their names? And which ones were they? It depends which gospels you read. Was the stone rolled away before the women got to the tomb or not? What did they see in the tomb? Did they see a man? Did they see two men? Or did they see an angel? Depends which gospel you read. What were they told to tell the disciples? Were the disciples supposed to stay in Jerusalem to see Jesus, or were they supposed to go to Galilee? Depends which gospel you read. Did the women tell anybody, or were they silent about it? Depends which gospel you read.
All rise, and welcome to another episode of The Defense Rests. The objection you just heard that we're going to tackle today and on the next episode is by Dr. Bart Ehrman. And obviously what he's objecting to is the accounts of the death and resurrection of Jesus. He's claiming they're inconsistent accounts, and therefore we have inconsistent eyewitness testimony, and therefore we really can't trust what the Bible says. Welcome to The Defense Rests. We're going to tackle this one like we tackle all of the objections to the Christian faith, where we look at claims for and objections against the Christian faith from a legal perspective. I'm Abdu Murray. I'm a trial attorney and itinerant speaker, and I'm excited about today's episode because it is part one of the season finale. So many of you have written in with such complimentary statements about the podcast, how much it's helped you, how you've enjoyed the thoroughness of the podcast and the presentation. That really warms my heart quite a bit, and I'm so appreciative of our listeners. And if you find this to be valuable and you want to share it with others, please do so. It would be wonderful to increase the engagement level we have with our audience on The Defense Rests. So please do feel free to share it. And by the way, this being part one of the season finale, part two will come up soon, and it will also be addressing this issue on harmonization of the resurrection accounts. And can we actually reconcile seemingly disparate and contradictory, or are they, contradictory accounts of what happened to Jesus in the last day of his life before he was crucified and 3 days later, his resurrection. And I thought it was fitting to do that, by the way, for this particular episode, because as you might recall, we began this inaugural season of The Defense Rests with an episode on the burden of proof, and then followed it up with multi-part episodes on the resurrection narrative and the historical reality of the resurrection, using burden of proof as our backdrop and then looking at the case for, and we addressed some of the objections against the resurrection. Well, one of the chief resurrection objections is this idea that the resurrection narratives themselves have irreconcilable discrepancies. So I thought it fitting that we would take the burden of proof, we would take what we've learned about looking at witnesses. If you're not familiar with the way in which we've talked about how you assess seemingly contradictory evidence from different witnesses, or how you assess eyewitness testimony in the first place, what the burdens of proof actually are, what the differences are between circumstantial evidence and direct evidence, I do recommend, if you're just tuning in for the first time, go back and look at this season. You'll get a good foundation of how evidence works in a trial setting and how lawyers and judges and juries assess evidence, present evidence, and understand the arguments made from the evidence. So if you're a newbie, please continue listening, but I would strongly urge you to go back and look at those episodes, particularly burden of proof and the evidence for the resurrection. But look at them all because they will help you understand the arguments being made in this and the next episode. As I said, which are the season finale. Now, having said that, I want to commend many of you for having sent in, either via social media or other means, objections you'd like me to answer. And if you haven't done so, and you have an objection you'd like me to answer from a legal perspective, please do so. Please send that in. Follow me on social media. On Twitter, I'm Abdu Murray, ABDUMURRAY. On Instagram, I'm Abdu Murray 12. You have to include the 12, because if you don't, you'll follow somebody else who's not me. So include the 12. And like my Facebook page, I have a public figure page. I have a personal page that I never do anything with, but I also have a public figure page, Abdu Murray. It's facebook.com/Abdu Murray. Go there as well. And send me your objections. If you're a skeptic, send me your objection. If you know a skeptic, send me his or her objection. And if you've heard someone with an objection, or you have a video you want me to respond to, please send us that. I would love to be able to see if I can answer it from a legal perspective. I can't answer all the questions because while there's an answer to those questions, it's always difficult sometimes to fit a legal angle into some of that stuff. But sometimes it's really fun to find a way in which the rules of evidence actually can help us understand a good answer to a tough question. So when you send in your question, use the hashtag #TheDefenseRests, hashtag #TheDefenseRests, list your objection, and I'll see if I can make it part of the podcast. Next season, we're going to be addressing a couple of those. Rusty Allison submitted a good question on the difference between strong evidence and conclusive evidence. And I think that's an excellent one because oftentimes we misunderstand what conclusive evidence actually means. Josh McMillan asked us to talk about the objection of circularity. In other words, using the Bible to defend the Bible. Isn't that circular reasoning? And is it even logically possible or admissible in some way to use the Bible to defend it being either inerrant or God's word? I got another objection, one that I'm actually looking forward to doing because it references something that happened a while back. It is a special that was aired by, I want to say it was National Geographic. It may have been the History Channel. I think it was the History Channel, actually. It was on the so-called tomb of Jesus, or the lost tomb of Jesus, the Talpiot tomb in Jerusalem, Israel. And this claim that they found Jesus's bones, and that would be the death knell, haha, pun intended, to the resurrection. But it's false, and it's been proven false, and we'll address that. And we'll use the rules of evidence to actually engage with this claim that they found Jesus's tomb. And then Pat Brady asked us to respond to atheist Dan Barker, and specifically a video he made, and we're looking forward to doing that as well. So much coming up in season 2 of The Defense Rests. I'm itching to do it. We need the hiatus so we can prepare more episodes for you folks, but please do send us in your objections. We'd be more than happy to think about how we can make them a part of the podcast. Thank you for the community. Well, anyway, here we are, talking now, in this particular episode, about alleged contradictions in the resurrection narrative. And you heard Dr. Ehrman go through quite a bit in the beginning of the show with strong rhetorical force. He talks about all the various discrepancies in the gospel accounts, taking Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, pitting them against each other, saying that Matthew might say this, but John says this. And if John says this, then Luke says this, and they're all different. Whether it's about the death of Jesus, what time of the day, and in fact, what day did Jesus die on? Or did the robbers who were hanging with Jesus, the two who were hanging beside him, did they both mock Jesus? Did one come to his defense at some point? Did the curtain of the temple rip in half before Jesus died or after he died? And he tries to show a discrepancy there. Moving on to the resurrection, he wants to know who went to the tomb on the third day. Was it Mary by herself, as John seems to suggest, or was it Mary and other women? And who were the women? What were their names? All this kind of stuff. Did the disciples go in and see the body of Jesus? Was it more than one or just one? Because it seems to suggest that there's a discrepancy between these accounts, between John and Luke. So here's what he's saying, and it sounds really, really powerful. Like, my goodness, if these guys can't get this right, and this is the central claim of Christianity, what reason do I have to trust these accounts at all? Now, that is rhetorically powerful, very rhetorically powerful. But as we've learned over the course of the episodes here, rhetoric and powerful rhetoric, while persuasive, isn't always conclusive. It can be something that causes us to think, and it should be. And in that sense, I want to thank Dr. Ehrman for actually getting Christians to think deeply about what the scripture says, and for giving Christians the impetus to read the scriptures carefully. Because as I'm going to show you in a little while, when you read the scriptures carefully, they begin to answer the objections themselves. In other words, you don't always need to go outside of the Bible to answer a seeming contradiction within the Bible, because some of the contradictions arise just because someone either has inadvertently or willingly refused to read the text carefully. And I can tell you as a trial lawyer, I can tell you that when I've deposed witnesses of various kind, when I've sat them down at a deposition and I've taken their testimony, and I've seen it later on, and I presented it to somebody at trial, and I've said, wait a minute, back then you said this, but now you're saying this. Sometimes they can explain the discrepancy. Or if they say one thing and another witness says a completely different thing, sometimes there is a good explanation of the discrepancy. And so before I would hop up and down and bang on tables and object and make statements to the jury about how fallacious and how lie-laden someone's testimony is, I better find out whether or not there's a good explanation, because I'll lose credibility. I will. As a lawyer, I'll tell you this. If I've pointed out what's only an apparent contradiction in someone's testimony, and then there's a perfectly logical explanation that I should have seen had I actually carefully considered their testimony, the jury will see right through me. They will see, and the judge will likely see, what I've done is I've played fast and loose with their testimony to make it look like a contradiction exists, even when there isn't one. Now, sometimes there is one, or at least there's one that's so difficult that a simple, careful understanding of their testimony won't do. You have to go to outside sources and find out if there's complementary corroborative evidence, and that has to happen. But oftentimes, I do think many of these objections can be answered just by reading the text itself, reading the eyewitness testimony itself, and it suddenly goes away. This goes back, friends, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this goes back to the idea of the burden of proof. You see, yes, if you're making the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, you bear the burden of proving that claim. But if someone says there's contradictions in the gospel narratives about how it happened and all these things, the burden of proof does not necessarily rest on you initially to prove that there are no contradictions. No, a person who says there's contradictions has to do more than just say there's contradictions. They actually have to show you what those contradictions are, cite to the record, cite to the testimony, or in this case, the Gospels, and say, Matthew says this, but Luke says this, and all these kind of things. That has to be the minimum level of presentation, or the proffer, as we say in the law, of a contradiction or a inconsistent statement. Now, Dr. Ehrman did do that in his opening remarks, and he said it elsewhere as well, where he's pointed out and referenced the biblical narratives, specifically calling out John or Mark as being inconsistent with each other. So that's one way in which you can meet a minimal burden of proof. But we do need more to substantiate it. In other words, what is the contradiction in the first place? And is it substantial? Is it a substantial contradiction? Because without that, have you really met your burden of proof? And the answer is not really. See, there's something there to think about, but it's not enough to undermine a core belief or a core claim. What I mean is that Dr. Ehrman, for example, raises and correctly cites the passages at issue, but then he just leaves it there as if citing the passages is enough. You know, it's a sort of a rant, powerfully rhetorical, but reading them in terms of reading the actual passages in their context goes further to see if, in fact, there's a contradiction. But for some alleged contradictions, it's more rhetorically powerful, and Dr. Ehrman knows this, and he uses this, and I'm not faulting him for it, but he uses this. He just reads them off. It says this in Mark, but it says this in John. It says this in Luke, but it says this in Matthew. These kind of things, and you just leave it hanging there. That's powerful because it seems like the contradictions are so obvious that simply listing them is enough to dazzle you into thinking he's right. Now, I want to be clear. I've only shared an edited version of Dr. Ehrman's comments because, frankly, in this YouTube video, which you can get all of, he's speaking at SES, the Southern Evangelical Seminary, as part of a debate or dialogue series in 2016. You can get the whole thing on YouTube. I encourage you to watch the whole thing on YouTube. But I can't give you everything because, frankly, he shotgun blasts everything. And we don't have time enough in these 2 episodes to go hunt down every BB that came out of the shotgun shell and try to put them back in. So I decided to take a few of the objections, some of the more, I think, poignant and pointed ones, and see if we can harmonize these things and come together with a fully orbed view of what really happened at Jesus' death and his resurrection, and whether or not we can trust what the Bible says. So we're going to address that. In the main, we'll address that in part 2. So stay tuned. But before we do that, we do have to talk about some groundwork. I'm going to address some of the contradictions here in this episode, but I do want to lay some groundwork on eyewitness testimony. Now, the claim, the whole basis for this objection is that if there is errant testimony, if the testimony of the various gospel writers is errant, in other words, it doesn't line up with each other, then the whole thing is suspect. And there's a rhetorical force to this objection, and it stems from the Christian belief in the inerrancy of the Bible. It actually preys upon that claim as a weakness, not a strength. In other words, if a Christian says the Bible contains no errors, it's inerrant, well, then someone can say, all I need to show you is one thing that's an error, and you will have to abandon your belief that the Bible is inerrant. Now, I believe in inerrancy. I am an inerrantist. I want to make that absolutely clear about this, and that's after an investigation. If you know my story, coming from a Muslim background, I was not an inerrantist. I thought the Bible was full of errors and could not be trusted. I've since changed my mind after an investigation. But let me put that aside for just a moment and look at this as a lawyer would look at it, as someone who's trying to investigate the issue and come to it with as unbiased an opinion as I possibly can. I want to take the force away from the objection. Remember what the force is based on? The force of the objection that the Bible contains contradictions in the resurrection accounts is based on the inerrancy issue. And if the Bible has errors, then it can't be trusted at all, and so you throw the whole thing away. Well, why should that be the case? Why should that be the case? Let's take the inerrancy issue off the table for just a moment and not ask ourselves, is the Bible divinely inspired, but is the Bible historically reliable? Let's take that as the baseline. The inerrancy stuff we can deal with later, but for right now, let's see, is the Bible historically reliable? And give it the same treatment we would give testimony from multiple witnesses in a trial. Because when we do that, when we remove that divine inspiration aspect of it from this particular inquiry, and I'm not saying we should do that all the time, I'm just saying for this particular inquiry, what most people, including Dr. Ehrman, will have to actually acknowledge is that despite the apparent, and they're only apparent, discrepancies of the earliest testimony of what happened to Jesus, what you're left with is the New Testament record is, even according to Dr. Ehrman, and the most skeptical of sources, the New Testament is the earliest testimony or documentary evidence we have of what happened to Jesus of Nazareth. And he was, even Dr. Ehrman will say, a figure of history. And in fact, he is history's most influential figure. And we would do ourselves a historical disservice if we simply discounted the New Testament record simply because we find what appear to be contradictions in details about the crucifixion and resurrection narratives. So let's take them as eyewitness accounts. Let's take the different gospels as eyewitness accounts, or at least documentary evidence of what happened to Jesus, or a conglomeration of eyewitness accounts. And when you do that, here's what you first ask yourself. Are they reliable? Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Maybe they're partly reliable, maybe they're partly unreliable. That's what you do with witnesses. You don't just discount them because they seem to not agree. You ask yourself, do the disagreements matter? And are the disagreements only apparent? And maybe they are reliable after all. Because I'll tell you, friends, I've taken the deposition and cross-examined plenty of witnesses and can already tell you that I don't think I've ever come across a perfect witness, a witness who never had an error in their testimony. My friend J. Warner Wallace, who you all have hopefully had the pleasure of hearing on this podcast as a guest, is a nationally recognized, award-winning homicide cold case detective. And he says in his own blogs, he's never run across a perfect witness who hasn't had some level of error, usually in a small detail, in their testimony, especially if they're a credible witness, if they're a truthful witness. Even the truthful witnesses have small errors. Now, the untruthful ones have these huge, gigantic, glaring errors that usually go to the heart of the claim of what they're trying to say. But the truthful ones might have small errors that they maybe remember to fix later because their memory is jogged by something. But there is no such thing as a perfect witness, even when that witness is being truthful. People make mistakes in accounts all the time. They are usually minor if they are telling the truth. And minor details, while likely interesting, don't actually undercut the major point the witness is making. And if there's more than one witness who testifies to a particular fact, even if they all get some peripheral details wrong, the jury, you ladies and gentlemen, would be perfectly justified in believing the witness on the central fact. Errors don't necessarily mean unreliable. In fact, let me read for you something. So friends, I'm pulling up the jury instructions, section 105 of the Judicial Council of California Criminal Jury Instructions in 2006, and I'll compare that also with the Michigan Model Criminal Jury Instruction 3.6. So the California one says this: do not automatically reject testimony just because of inconsistencies or conflicts. Consider whether the differences are important or not. People sometimes honestly forget things or make mistakes about what they remember. Also, two people may witness the same event yet see or hear it differently. In other words, the jury instruction given by a judge to a jury is just because you hear something that seems contradictory or may in fact actually be contradictory, don't discount it wholly because sometimes people have mistakes or they've seen something or experienced something from a different perspective. The Michigan Model Criminal Jury Instruction 3.6, Section 4 says, sometimes the testimony of different witnesses will not agree, and you must decide which testimony you accept. You should think about whether the disagreement involves something important or not. That's key to what I'm going to talk about next. And whether you think someone is lying or is simply mistaken. People see and hear things differently, and witnesses may testify honestly, but simply be wrong about what they thought they saw or remembered. It is also a good idea to think about which testimony agrees best with the other evidence in the case. Those are jury instructions. Those are accepted instructions that lawyers ask judges to read to the jury when they are assessing the credibility of seemingly contradictory evidence. So you see the import there? A mistake might be made, but the overall point is important because if it's a mistake in a minor detail, no one doubts that the major thing happened. If it's a matter of perspective, people might get things differently in terms of understanding what was going on. Let me give you a couple of examples on the matter of making mistakes. So let's say we have a particular case where there is a personal injury case. It's like a car accident case. And there's a driver of a red car, and this is the person who got injured. So he's the plaintiff. And he's claiming that as he was going through the green light, the person who turned left and oncoming traffic turned when their arrow was red, and so T-boned them and hurt them seriously. So we have the red car coming through the intersection as the blue car turns left when it shouldn't have. That's the claim. Now, who turned when they shouldn't have? That's the issue. Let's say you have witnesses who are out there who all saw it. Some people were walking by on the sidewalk, others were driving by. And let's say that one witness says that it was sunny outside and the sun was low in the sky, so it's possible that one person didn't quite see the light or whatever it might be. That's minorly important. But they're saying it was sunny outside. The other person says, well, it wasn't really sunny. It was more like it was hazy outside. In fact, so hazy that you could even see the haze in the air. Well, clearly, they're not both right about this. But let's say they both testify that the red car went through the intersection and the other car turned left into the red car. You're no longer going to dispute that fact, even though these two witnesses don't get it right as to whether the sun was out clearly or was hazy outside. You're not going to doubt that the cars hit each other in the way that the red car claims. Why? Because they both agree on the central fact, which is that the one car hit the other car. Them getting the weather wrong is utterly irrelevant, unless weather was an issue, like someone skidded through because it was wet outside or whatever. But that's not the claim. That's not the claim. It's just a matter of what color the light was. What color was the light that allowed the person to turn left? That's the issue. And these witnesses don't testify about the weather being related to that issue. That doesn't call into the question their otherwise agreeing testimony about what happened. You see that? But also there's a level of perspective, and sometimes words matter. So for example, as a business litigator, a lot of my cases didn't involve car accidents. They pretty much involved meetings and documents and these kind of things with regard to businesses. So who participated or was present at certain meetings was always pretty important to many of the cases I had. So let's say it's important about whether a certain witness heard another witness say something at a meeting, or if that witness said something at that meeting. Let's just say that's important. We'll call this witness Witness A. So let's say we're at a deposition and the lawyer on the other side of my case is asking Witness A, did you participate in the meeting? Okay, that's the specific wording. Did you participate in the meeting? Now, let's assume for a moment that the lawyer is simply asking in participate, what they mean by the word participate is, were you present? Were you asked to be at the meeting, and were you present at the meeting? Okay, that's all that lawyer means. But Witness A thinks by participate, it means, was I present and did I do something or say something? Okay, so they have two different interpretations of what the word participate means, and both are relatively reasonable. And so the lawyer says to Witness A, did you participate in the meeting? And Witness A, because they didn't do anything, they just sat there, says, no, I didn't participate in the meeting. Okay? Now, let's say 3 days later, we're deposing Witness B. And I ask the question, Witness B, did Witness A participate in the meeting? And Witness B says, yes, they did participate in the meeting. And the reason they said that they did was because Witness B took the meaning, participate means simply being present because you were asked to. So you see what's going on? It looks like this contradictory evidence that Witness B is saying, yes, Witness A did participate, and Witness A is saying, no, I didn't. But they both have different understandings of what participate means. Witness B thinks participate means simply be present. Witness A thinks it means be present and do something. So we can clear up the discrepancy by asking these witnesses at trial, what did you mean when you said yes? Or what did you think the lawyer meant when he said participate? And then suddenly the discrepancy goes away and the jury can see. It's a matter of perspective on what this word means. Now, I'll just tell you this up front. A good lawyer knows how to get clarity. So I would never use that phrase, did you participate? I'd say, were you present? Yes. Did you participate? No. When I say participate, I mean, did you do or say anything at the meeting? No. Did you take notes? No. I would go that way to make this clarity. But oftentimes these things go unnoticed and seemingly contradictory evidence gets admitted into court and you have to clarify it. But do you see my point? Is that either a matter of perception, you can be mistaken, or as a matter of perception, you can be completely honest and truthful and be accurate. It's just what you heard or what you saw is different based on your perspective. I think that's largely what's going on in many of the accounts in the so-called discrepancies in the resurrection narratives. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. So here's a good example of how, when we carefully read the eyewitness testimony, a seeming contradiction or discrepancy is actually cleared up by a careful reading of the eyewitness account, but also seeing that the various eyewitnesses have different focuses in terms of who they're focusing on and what particular fact they're focusing on that are complementary but not contradictory. So in the Gospel of John depicts Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb of Jesus, hoping to anoint the body and all these kind of things after his crucifixion. And it suggests that she's there by herself. More to that point in a moment. But she comes after seeing the stone rolled away and the body not there. She runs over to Peter and the beloved disciple, sort of responding to the empty tomb. So what we read in chapter 20 of John's Gospel, verse 3, we see this. So Peter went out with the beloved disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stopping to look in, he saw the linen clothes lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came. So, in other words, John's Gospel is saying that Mary talks to Peter, Peter and another disciple run to the tomb. So there's more than one person running to the tomb. Now, you read the parallel account in Luke chapter 24, and you see what looks like a pretty serious problem, because it looks like only one of them went. When you read in Luke chapter 24, verse 12, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them told these things to the apostles, but these words seemed to them an idle tale. This is starting in verse 11, and they did not believe them. But, and it says this in verse 12, Luke 24, verse 12, but Peter, not the other disciple, Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen clothes by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. So you see, we have a contradiction. John says Peter and the other disciple ran to the tomb, but Luke says only one ran to the tomb. Contradiction, right? Well, maybe not. Let's look at Luke's gospel a little more carefully and in the full context. Just 12 verses later, Luke chapter 24, the same chapter where he seems to say there's only one disciple, Peter, who went to the tomb. 12 verses later, we see that it's multiple people. Now, this is the account of the Emmaus Road, where two disciples are walking down the road and Jesus encounters them. And Luke says that they were kept from recognizing Jesus. They're telling Jesus about what had happened in Jerusalem, about Jesus' death and resurrection and all this. So they're telling Jesus the story as if Jesus doesn't already know, because they don't know it's Jesus. And they say this: some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. Did you catch it? Some of those who were with us, in other words, some of us disciples, went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. So John's gospel says Mary tells Peter and another disciple, and they run over to the tomb. So that's two. Luke seems to suggest in Luke 24, verse 12, that only Peter went. But in Luke 24, the very same account, 12 verses later, the disciples are telling Jesus what happened, and they say some, which is not one, it's more than one, some of those who were with us went to the tomb. That is complementary evidence. In other words, Luke himself, the gospel writer, recognizes that more than one person went to the tomb. Why does he not mention the beloved disciple in his gospel in verse 12 of chapter 24, whereas John mentions both? Who knows, other than Luke is focusing on Peter, not to the exclusion of the beloved disciple. He includes him later in the Emmaus Road account, where the disciples say that some of us went, but he's not excluding that person. He's just focusing on Peter. And that is the point, is that Luke's account is not contradictory, it's complementary. It just simply has a different focus. Now, while we're on John chapter 20, let's address a specific objection Bart Ehrman raised in the clip we just played at the beginning of the episode. Notice what he said. He said, how many women came to the tomb? Was it Mary Magdalene and one other person? Was it multiple people? Was it just Mary Magdalene, as John seems to say? In other words, he's pitting the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which suggest more than one woman coming to the tomb, against John, which seems to suggest in chapter 20 that only one woman came to the tomb. Now, this seems like a contradiction, unless you read the gospel narrative carefully. Yes, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are saying that more than one woman came. Clear. It's clear as day. When you read John chapter 20, you're thinking, man, there's a discrepancy here. Because John chapter 20, verse 1, now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. My goodness, only one person went? There's a discrepancy here. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, now this is the key part. This is where careful reading will clear up the discrepancy, just like it did in Luke chapter 24, where verses 12 and verses 24 actually complement each other. Here we have the same thing happening. So John chapter 20, verse 1 says it's only Mary Magdalene. Or does it really say that? It just says Mary Magdalene. It doesn't say it's only her. But John chapter 20, verse 2 has Mary Magdalene saying this to the disciples. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Did you catch that? And we do not know where they have laid him. If Mary Magdalene went to the tomb by herself, saw an empty tomb, and went over to Peter and the disciple that Jesus loved, the beloved disciple, and she's the only one who saw that the tomb was empty, and she's the only one who did not know where the body was laid, why does she say, and we do not know where they have laid him? The reason she says we is because she was with other people. John does not exclude those other people. He simply focuses his attention on Mary because she is the one who took the initiative to go to the disciples, and she is the one who took the initiative to speak. That's all that's going on. So you see, John is not saying only one woman went. He's not saying only Mary Magdalene went. He's saying more than one woman went. While he's focusing on Mary Magdalene, the other Gospels say that multiple women went to the tomb, and that and John's Gospel are in complete harmony when you understand the different perspectives and focuses they have on the narrative. Well, friends, much more can be said, and much more will be said in part 2 of this particular season finale episode, where we harmonize what happened at Jesus' death and his resurrection. We're going to address Dr. Ehrman's objections. We're going to address all of them. We already addressed a couple of as it stands right now during this episode. But let's not forget that we need to understand, if there's a discrepancy, is it material? And is it possible that there is no discrepancy? It's just a misunderstanding on our part of what the witnesses are actually focusing on. And when you take those two things into account, I think you'll see, just as in every criminal case, as in every civil case, that sometimes all we have to do is a little bit more homework, a little bit more scrutiny, and seeming contradictions get cleared right up. So we'll talk more about this on the next and final episode of Season 1 of The Defense Rests. Until then, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense rests. See you next time.
To find out more about our ministry or to donate, visit our website at embracethetruth.org. All Rise is a production of Embrace the Truth.